So there are some disadvantages to crowns, but otherwise, they're quite important things.
Deep among the confidential records of a sealed document from Windsor Castle emerged, but Queen Elizabeth II never meant for the whole public to see. It included extraordinary directives pertaining to her private property, eschewing expectations and inciting rage among the royal family. The recipient selected was not a senior royal, not a related of Camilla, but Lady Louise Windsor, a person who had avoided the spotlight her entire life. The ruling reignited long-standing rivalry and caused indignation behind the scenes. What made Lady Louise the Queen's choice? Come along as we reveal the royal infighting brought on by Lady Louise's transfer of the Queen's personal estate. A revelation that destroyed royal quiet. It began with routine. Upkeep. An employee designated to rearrange one of Windsor Castle's libraries with less usage pulled an outdated bookcase that is not close to the wall. And that's then everything was different. In the background of volumes item has been neglected for many years, nestled into an opening that appeared to carefully cut out a leather portfolio with the royal emblem on it. The employee, a former palace employee throughout a period of almost 30 years, knowing this wasn't anything to be right away, treated informally. The portfolio was sealed using the type of wax stamp that had not been utilized in formal royal correspondence for many years. However, the seal's signature was indisputable. Queen Elizabeth was the source of this. Herself. According to protocol, such discoveries should be reported right away to senior household employees. In the three of the Queen's most dependable former advisors were called in. They arriving independently, each pledged to confidentiality prior to seeing what had been found. When the seal was broken and read the material, witnesses claim a startled stillness descended upon the room. There was a comprehensive instruction written in the unique handwriting of the Queen describing how a property will be disposed of that was not meant to be. Not Balmoral, where she had died. Not her getaway in Norfolk was Sandringham. This was something really different, something things had been kept hidden by concealment that had persisted for over 6 months century. The document had a date, time-stamped and observed by 2 people whose names were withheld for privacy, but the information was clear obvious. Elizabeth the Queen had appointed Lady Louise Windsor, being the only inheritor of this enigmatic property, coupled with everything that's inside its walls. There was no mention of any other family members. Additionally, there were no arrangements for shared access. Just Louise by herself. What further enhanced the discovery, the timing was explosive. The document had been established 3 years prior to the Queen's passing, indicating that this wasn't a last-minute choice to decline health. This was computed and had been kept very carefully under wraps. Senior palace officials who believed they understood every aspect of the Queen's life were caught off guard. Even Charles the King, when informed, apparently didn't know about the existence of the property, let alone his mother's intentions. The initial everyone's question was clear. Why keep this hidden? If the Queen desired to depart, why not give her granddaughter something? Incorporate it into her formal will? Why leave? Through the complex procedure of hiding the property, as well as her intentions? The response, insiders would soon learn, had little to do with shielding Louise from precisely the kind of the scrutiny and confrontation that was now erupting all around her. However, the more the crucial query was what precisely did Louise inherit? What made Camilla's relatives responding as if they had been personally taken advantage of? The mystery of Scotland, everything was altered by that. The property located in the question is located in one of the most isolated areas of the Scottish Highlands, distant from royal observers and tourism routes. Locals had known it simply for decades as the Grey House, a massive stone estate that has a small yet devoted workforce employees, and occasionally had guests who came and went without fanfare. No one associated it with the royal family, since there was no official link. The property had been acquired via an intricate web of trusts in the early 1950s, soon after Elizabeth's ascension to the throne. The deal had been designed especially to maintain the removing the Crown estate from the picture, guaranteeing that the property would be regarded as private as opposed to public. This was not out of the ordinary. The monarch possessed many private properties. What was peculiar that this specific estate had remained entirely unnoticed. There were no pictures of the property in open archives. It was never stated in any biography of a royal or historical narrative. Employees that were employed there had signed contracts for confidentiality that went well beyond standard employment contracts, with serious legal repercussions for any violation. Even the property's formal name, only utilized internally documents, was purposefully generic to don't attract notice. The property itself was significant. More than 200 acres of highland landscape, with the primary residence comprising almost 40 rooms, yet its value had nothing to do with location or size. What made this property invaluable was what Queen Elizabeth has kept more than 7 decades in power. This was her personal, private archive, museum and refuge from the pressures of public life. The rooms had things that academics and historians might grant access to anything. There were private correspondence with her father, George V VI, during the years prior to his unanticipated monarch. Annotated journals covering her whole reign, recording her personal ideas regarding global affairs, political family issues, and leaders. Artwork that had been taken out of public distribution and kept for storage. Jewelry that existed before the crown assortment of jewels. And possibly the majority notably, correspondence with individuals such as Winston Churchill to Margaret Thatcher, unaltered by the sanitization that usually has an impact on official documents. However, beyond the historical relics, the estate owned anything even more intimate. The Queen Elizabeth had utilized this land as her authentic retreat, the location. She visited when the monarchy grew too burdensome to endure. Although the general populace was aware of Sandringham and Balmoral, were where when she really needed to, she went. Vanish. The gardens were planned to her requirements. Her actual reading was reflected in the library. Desires rather than the meticulously chosen, publicly displayed image. Even her true tastes were mirrored in the kitchen. Instead of mandatory state dinners, employees that had worked there for it was described as the only location over the years. The Queen was fully visible to them. At ease. She strolled around the property without security is in the air. She worked for hours in the library without scheduled visits that controlled her timetable. She only invited the individuals she truly desired to see, not the protocol required her to amuse. In every significant sense, this was her real house, which she had maintained, concealed from almost everyone. Now, discovering that this is so personal, all of the space had been given to Lady Louise sent shockwaves through those who believed they comprehended the Queen's priorities. What made this specific granddaughter deserving of the Queen's most personal haven? Additionally, how had a bond strong enough to justify the development of such a gift without nobody noticed the bond? Evolving? To comprehend the reasons why Queen Lady Louise was chosen by Elizabeth, you must look past the royal family's public image family and look at the connections that evolved away from cameras and formal interactions. As the world concentrated on Harry and William on the line, regarding succession and upcoming monarchs, something more subdued, but no less profound was taking place between her and the Queen. Second youngest grandchild, Lady Louise had always been unique. From other young royals, born with a vision impairment that necessitated several surgeries, she was raised with humility. That privilege and celebrity frequently ruin. Prince Edward and Sophie, her parents, made the conscious decision to increase their kids out of the spotlight, rejecting royal titles that might have been theirs and demanding a regular education as opposed to royal privilege. This strategy was exactly in line with the principles that Queen Elizabeth upheld privately, but wasn't always able to alongside other grandchildren. She observed Louise develop into an intelligent, well-read young lady who demonstrated a sincere interest in history, especially the history of royalty, without any seeming intention to take advantage of that link for one's own benefit. Louise asked inquiries not to come across as intelligent, but due of her sincere desire to comprehend. More than she said, she listened. Moreover, crucially, she never once leaked private family discussions with the press or made advantage of her royal connections for attention on social media. The connection developed while traveling in the summer to Balmoral. While other relatives regarded these as required appearances, gathering companions and setting up their keeps up with other obligations, Louise would arrive by themselves and remain longer. She walked with the Queen in the morning, without anticipating a discussion, at ease with silence in a manner that's uncommon among youth. She spent afternoons in the library, actually engrossed in reading instead of surreptitiously looks at her phone. Elizabeth, Queen who has lived their entire lives surrounded by those that desired something from her, discovered that Louise had no agenda. Revitalizing. No requests were made for favors and tactful future positioning benefit, or well-written remarks intended to gain favor. Louise just liked spending time with her grandmother, and in response, the Queen shared more of herself than she usually disclosed to anybody. During one specific important summer visit prior to Louise assisted the Queen in her demise. Grandma arranges personal documents that had been building up for many years. although other relatives would have considered this to be a laborious task. Assigned to employees, Louise acknowledged it for what it was, a window into the past. She inquired about pictures and desired to understand the meaning behind letters, and demonstrated a sincere interest in the specifics of the incidents that had influenced the contemporary world. It happened during these protracted afternoons, spent organizing memories, that Queen Elizabeth made a choice. She needed a guardian for her personal background, someone who would recognize its importance without taking use of it for oneself. Louise had demonstrated that she was not just deserving, but perfect for this duty. Later, the ladies of the Queen will be waiting. Remembered minor shifts in her speech. Concerning Louise. Allusions to the individual who, listening, my archivist slipped inside discussions. When relatives would sometimes write Louise off as timid, or the Queen's lack of ambition would correct them in private, emphasizing that being silent is not the same as an emptiness, between privacy and being unimportant. However, the most significant indication may have come from the Queen's actions that summertime. She provided Louise with unlimited access to her private library at Balmoral, something that even Charles possessed never received. Louise could peruse, read, and even take books without being asked. First, get permission. For a king who had spent 70 years under close supervision in all facets of her existence, this degree of trust was exceptional. By the time Louise went back to her studies that fall, the choice had already been created. The estate in Scotland, with all of its recollections and historical artifacts, would visit the granddaughter, who has demonstrated preservation was more important to her than exposure, and the past over the news. The monarch had discovered her replacement, not to the throne, but to what she thought as crucial, the custody of her true self. What was Camilla's? How does the family respond to this news? When the Parker BS family discovered the reality, the Lady Louise's disclosure inherited the private estate of the Queen hit like a physical blow to Camilla's family. They had been observing their place in the royal hierarchy bolster. Camilla had left mistress, wife, and queen consort. Despite not being awarded titles, children had been progressively incorporated into the family story, going to additional events, gaining further acknowledgement, and constructing ties. They sought to strengthen their position in the history of royalty. Next, using a single secret document, they found that they had been outwitted by 20-year-old who had never seemed to be participating in the game at all. The decision of the Queen to forego her son's wife's entire family, to provide her with the best a granddaughter's personal belongings, who was not related to Camilla's children, conveyed a clear message regarding who genuinely belonged inside circle. The revelation that Queen Elizabeth had purposefully left them out from her greatest personal legacy was terrible. Beyond the content value, it was the denial they was impossible to ignore. The Queen had examined the entire family, including Camilla's children, and concluded they didn't deserve access to her own haven. Rather, she had selected a person who, by conventional methods, ought to have been way down the list of things to think about. Initial responses in Camilla's, according to reports, the close family explosive. Family phone conversations members became enraged as they attempted to comprehend what had transpired. Did they overlook this? When did the Queen make this choice? And most importantly, could it be disputed? Camilla herself, the palace claims insiders, vacillated between rage and hurt. She had worked for years to restore her reputation in order to get beyond the scandal around her connection to Charles and gain acceptance as a member of the household. She had followed the guidelines, observed protocol, and made a sincere effort to establish relationships with family members. However, Queen Elizabeth's last deed had been to clearly identify who was truly family and who was just next to it. The circumstance was complicated by the reality that Charles he seems taken aback. If the monarch had not been aware of the estate or his mother's intentions, Camilla could scarcely be held accountable for failing to anticipate the inheritance. However, that logic evaluation did not alleviate the emotional effect. If Charles was aware the message was evident whether it was or not. Louise was inside, and the Parker BS kids were out. According to reports, Tom Parker BS was the first to recommend taking legal action. He spoke with lawyers who were experts in estate law, seeking any perspective that could challenge the inheritance. Could they contend that the Queen hadn't been completely capable when she made the title? Could they assert the property ought to have been taken into account? A portion of the Crown estate as opposed to private properties? Were there any procedural anomaly that could render the transfer invalid? The expert's evaluation was not positive. The date on the document was years before to the Queen's passing, ending any debate regarding decisions made on the deathbed under stress or perplexity. Several witnesses had confirmed the Queen's signature and mental acuity at the moment. The property's private status, as opposed to Crown holding, was well established. Over many years of different ownership, there were no mistakes in procedure, no unclear wording, no legal gaps to take advantage of. However, more hazardous than the public's lack of legal alternatives relationship disaster that is difficult the Queen's desires would result. Even putting out the notion of challenging the press had learned about inheritance, and the response had been prompt and harsh. The people of Britain, yet in remembrance of their longest-serving king, was furious at the notion that the Queen's last desires ought to be asked. Editorial pages denounced Camilla's clutching actions family. Social media exploded with hashtags battling and defending Louise the Parker BS family. The circumstances intensified when someone most likely from Camilla's family members in the legal team had consulted and disclosed the precise arguments they were thinking about. The implication that Queen Elizabeth could not have been completely capable of crossing a line that would not be accepted by the general public. Surveys revealed strong opposition to any judicial dispute involving numerous respondents claiming that it would harm their perception of Charles and Camilla if they let such a competition to go ahead. King Charles's senior advisors reportedly convened urgent meetings to talk about damage control. The agreement was evident. Any legal dispute needs to be ceased right away. The price to the monarchy's standing would be disastrous. Charles was placed in an impossible position, torn between his wife's suffering sentiments and a furious family on one side, as well as his mother's memory and public viewpoint on the other. How did the whole unravel something? The conflict that revealed everything. The encounter between Camilla and Prince Edward were never intended to occur. Each side had been suggested that the issue be resolved amicably, should steer clear of direct conflict that could lead into an irreversible breakup of the family. However, feelings were running too high, and the stakes were too high for strategic endurance. Camilla asked for the meeting, presenting it as an effort to comprehend the circumstances and identify common ground. As Louis's father, Edward felt required to protect his daughter from what he considered to be unjust assaults. What was intended to be a private discussion in a tiny sitting area in Clarence's home evolved into something much more intense. As stated by employees who were within earshot, Camilla started by expressing her hurt and bewilderment. She described the years of work she had into being welcomed into the family, the sacrifices she had made in order to Charles, and the cautious manner in which she had attempted to establish connections throughout generations. Next, she turned to the long-simmering charge beneath the surface throughout, that Sophie and Edward had purposefully fostered Louise's connection with the Queen for precisely this reason, to obtain an inheritance that would improve their family branch. Edward's, according to reports, the response was prompt and chilly. He emphasized that Louise's her grandmother's relationship had evolved organically without any orchestration or hidden agenda. He was observed that Louise had never requested nothing, never put herself in a position to advantage, and had been equally as taken aback as everyone else by the inheritance. He went on to say that if Camilla's family felt left out, maybe they ought to look into why the Queen had not felt enough near them, to talk about this aspect of her life. From then on, the conversation declined. Camilla is said to have mentioned the variations in the royal hierarchy, indicating as Queen Consort, she surpassed Edward and his whole family. She implied that the inheritance is undermine that structure and create a risky precedent. Edward refuted that rank. Had nothing to do with personal connections, as well as the Queen's decision about whom to trust with her personal information. She was the only one who could leave a legacy. The breakthrough or breaking point, depending to one's viewpoint, came when Camilla wondered if the Queen had been completely conscious of her actions. The idea that Elizabeth could have been tricked or perplexed brought Edward stood up. He allegedly told without a doubt, Camilla doubting the Queen's ability to think was not only offensive, but possibly disastrous for the whole family, and that if she kept going in that direction, she would encounter resistance not only from him, but from other relatives who would not put up with such disrespect to the remembrance of the late monarch. Sophie, Edward's spouse, had attended, but silent throughout the most of the conversation. She selected this time to talk, and she comments allegedly changed the situation completely. She gently noted that the inheritance wasn't the true problem itself, but what it disclosed about connections within the family. That the Queen had decided to share her most secret haven with a person she fully trusted. Instead of assaulting Louise, or raising concerns about the Queen's choice, Possibly everyone should consider the reasons for their trust. Relationships have evolved in the manner that they did. The gathering concluded without resolution. Camilla was the first to go, clearly angry. Sophie and Edward were still there, allegedly talking about damage control techniques to shield Louise from the growing hostility throughout the family. The word of the conflict swiftly spread through various variations of palace circles appearing based on which sides the story was being told by supporters. What nobody questioned, that the reconciliation was made possible via conflict. Considerably more difficult. They had drawn lines, allegations were made, and trust was eroded. The inheritance has shown weaknesses in the family that was much more than everyone was aware. The summer in which determined everything. To fully comprehend the reasons for Queen Elizabeth's decision did, you must return to that final. She was in Scotland for the entire summer. It was 3 years prior, in the summer of 2019. Her passing, and the summer in which the Secret A document was produced. Something took place. In the months that crystallized the Queen's thoughts, and resulted in a choice that would ultimately cause her to family separate. Louise had reached early July at Balmoral, intending to remain a couple weeks before going back to her research. However, the Queen requested that she prolong the visit, then prolong it once more. When Louise eventually departed, she had spent the latter part of September, more than 3 months, as she grandmother's friend in a manner that appeared to satisfy the Queen's had been absent. On lengthy strolls, Louise asked the question across the estate. The question that made all the difference. She were curious about what would happen to the Queen's confidential documents, the ones that revealed the truth about her reign instead of compared to the cleaned version that would find their way into official archives. Who would determine what academics could observe? Who would safeguard individuals' privacy who had confided in her? Who would ensure that the complex truth was revealed to history instead of oversimplified stories? The Queen's response was inadequate. She would always believed that this would be managed by official channels, by archaeologists and royal historians operating under stringent procedures. However, Louise's queries made she realized that using formal channels meant channels open to the public. She left nothing behind. In official hands would continue to be genuinely private. Eventually, everything would be freed, examined, and dissected by those who are unconnected to the situations that produced such documents. That the realization was unsettling. The monarch had spent 70 years being cautious about what she stated in public, aware that every word would be retained and examined. Her personal documents were not the same. They included her true thoughts, her true views, as well as her unvarnished responses to what happened as it happened. She would produce them in the presumption that they would stay confidential, or at the very least, be shielded by individuals who were aware of context and subtlety. Louise, without pressuring or requesting anything, had caused the Queen to recognize that she needed a different solution. She required someone who recognized the historical significance of maintaining these resources, but who also recognized the need for human protection, dignity, and privacy. Someone who would withstand pressure to make money or exaggerate, who would turn down a lucrative book, agreements, or documentary initiatives that would take advantage of personal suffering for the public consumption. Throughout that, Louise was put to the test by the Queen in little methods. She would tell tales of the past, disputes, observing whether Louise would repeat them to relatives, or in casual conversation, let details slide. She didn't. She would ask Louise what she thought. On the proper handling of specific documents, searching for indications of ambition or self-interest. She didn't find any. The majority, notably, she would sometimes leave priceless objects under Louise's supervision, and they consistently stayed in the same spot. They had been abandoned, never relocated, or investigated beyond what was required. By the Queen had made her in September. Choice. She had a private meeting with attorneys and started the procedure of establishing a trust that would possession of the Scottish property in addition to with all of its contents to Lady Louise Windsor when the Queen had away. She set it up to avoid official royal routes, to be kept secret until upon her departure, and to be legally unassailable once exposed. The monarch recognized that this choice would lead to confrontation. Regarding family relationships, she wasn't ignorant, or the painful emotions that would follow from such an explicit declaration of preference. However, she had also arrived at a time in her life when defending her legacy was more important than avoiding drama among the family. She had lived for 70 years, prioritizing duty over personal taste. It would be one of the rare occasions she acted in the opposite way. The document that she included a private letter to Louise. Not the message that was recorded would be found years later, but a written justification for her position. Within it, she admitted that Louise might encounter disagreement and criticism as a result of this heritage. She expressed regret for the load ahead of time. She was putting it on her granddaughter. However, she also stated that assurance that Louise was correct option, the sole option, since she symbolized attributes that the Queen cherished over everyone else: discretion, honesty, and a sincere regard for the past over headlines. Louise's departure from Balmoral, she was aware of the September estate and the Queen's intentions, but she'd been promised confidentiality, informed that it would take years for the transfer to occur, and encouraged to carry on with her life just like she had been. The Queen didn't want Louise to be burdened by anticipation, or to alter her conduct according to inheritance in the future. All she wanted Louise to know was that she was respected, trusted, and regarded as the preserver of more significant memories as opposed to crowns. And when Lady Louise moves into custody of the Queen's most private legacy, will judgment be sufficient to endure the current pressures encircling her? Please share your ideas with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and for more, subscribe. Additionally, click the next video that appears on your screen.